Can We Afford the Green New Deal? By Yeva Nersisyan and Randall Wray. Affordability, the MMT Approach. MMT maintains that a sovereign government is not financially constrained. It spends through electronic entries in bank accounts and can neither run out of them nor save them for the future. Wray, 2015. Nersisyan and Wray, 2019. What should constrain the spending of a sovereign government is the nation's available real resources. Excessive spending, therefore, creates problems not in terms of higher government deficits and debt, but in terms of true inflation. Similarly, taxes are used not to finance government spending, but to withdraw demand from the economy, creating space for government spending to move resources to the public sector without causing inflation. The more sensible critics of MMT accept the argument that we can financially afford the Green New Deal, but insist we need to raise taxes more or less in line with spending to avoid causing inflation. They go on to assert that increasing spending without raising taxes is a particularly dangerous practice, as it injects excess money into the economy that will cause inflation. For instance, Brad DeLong has argued, in reference to boosting federal government spending, that it is unreasonable to believe that the U.S. can have Swedish levels of government spending without Swedish levels of taxation. Footnote 1. C. Wray, 2019. DeLong is wrong. American workers already pay Northern European levels of taxation if you use an inclusive measure. All the mandatory deductions from American paychecks, pensions and health insurance, including the Obamacare mandates, called non-tax compulsory payments, or NTCPs, add up to a greater burden than what our rich peer countries' workers pay. For comparison purposes, Canadian workers pay an effective tax rate, including NTCPs, of just 11.5%. In Denmark, they pay 26.7%. In Norway, 32.4%. In Sweden, 38.3%. And in the United States, a whopping 43.2%. Brunig, 2019. In sum, we already pay higher taxes than the Swedes. We just don't call them taxes, even though they are as mandatory as Swedish taxes. Americans' take-home pay is already below that of the Swedes, which is obvious to anyone who travels to Northern Europe to envy the standard of living we do not enjoy. End footnote. The argument that taxes must be increased alongside the Green New Deal presumes that, first, implementing the Green New Deal will lead to a large increase in the demand for resources, and second, that raising taxes is the best way to relieve pressure on demand. We believe that those arguing for tax hikes have not carefully assessed the Green New Deal's inflationary potential, since there have been no studies of the Green New Deal that look at resource demands and savings. Instead, they rely on estimates that merely sum up the estimated dollar costs of Green New Deal projects, presuming this equates to additional government spending that requires taxes to pay for it. Whether or not we need tax hikes depends on the net increase of demand on the nation's resources, and not on some scary prediction of trillions of dollars of government red ink. We provide a first attempt to quantify the net resource demands in order to obtain some idea of the reduction of current aggregate private demand, consumption, and investment that might be required to release resources to the Green New Deal efforts, which allows us to deal with what would otherwise create an inflationary excess demand. It is not a foregone conclusion that the net increase will be beyond our available capacities. The Green New Deal will, in many areas, reorient currently employed resources, cutting environmentally and socially destructive uses of resources and shifting them to better use. Moreover, we have substantial unused capacity, and we will, along the way, further increase capacity. That is obvious in Euroland, which is probably operating at 25% or more below full capacity. But even the U.S. has substantial excess capacity, in spite of claims that we are at full employment. Over the past quarter century, we have had to repeatedly lower our estimate for the natural rate of unemployment, the rate below which inflation is supposed to pick up. In every recovery, because inflation never arrives as unemployment falls. Most recently, in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis, economists claimed that the natural rate of unemployment had increased to over 5%, yet the unemployment rate kept coming down, while inflation never materialized. Even the Federal Reserve has admitted that the inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation that underpins their policy decisions does not seem to exist anymore, if it ever did. Lee, 2019. We will not know precisely where the true inflation barrier is until we ramp up aggregate demand. Further, there is nothing natural about potential growth. We can raise our potential by prudent investment of our resources. Operating close to full capacity over a period will bring forth investment and more capacity. So potential output is to some degree determined by actual capacity use. Through the Green New Deal, we will also shift resources to better uses and gradually reduce the need to devote resources to dealing with the problems created by destructive processes. Dirty production processes require us to devote resources to cleanup. High inequality forces us to devote resources to dealing with the consequences of poverty, idleness, inadequate access to preventative care and early treatment, social isolation, and crime. To sum up, we need to obtain an inventory of the resources that can be made available to the Green New Deal projects to compare against the resources that will be required to implement the Green New Deal. This would include resources in excess supply because those that can be released from uses that will be eliminated by the Green New Deal's adoption. This is the true cost of the Green New Deal, and it will allow us to get some idea of the magnitude of the reduction of aggregate demand necessary to avoid inflationary pressures. Admittedly, this is difficult, and we are only providing a first step, using gross measures of underutilized resources currently available, resources that can be shifted, and resources that will be needed by Green New Deal projects. Footnote 2. In this policy brief, we do not assess the technological feasibility of the part of the Green New Deal that is focused on reversing climate change. We will assume that the science and technology exist. We have no expertise in that area. Instead, we focus on resource availability. End footnote. To be clear, we do recognize that implementation of the Green New Deal will shift spending from the private sector to the government sector. However, unlike other studies that evaluate the Green New Deal, we do not assume that we need to raise taxes merely because government spending rises. Instead, our position is that taxes should be raised only if the additional spending creates inflationary pressures. In general, it makes no difference in terms of inflation whether the dollar spent to hire resources comes from the government or from the private sector. Thus, A shift in spending from the private sector to the government required by the Green New Deal need not be inflationary. However, if the Green New Deal does take us to and beyond full employment of resources, we can adopt measures to counter inflation pressure, including raising taxes.